Ever wonder why some marketing just works? There's a secret sauce for every brand. We can help you find yours. We're IDEA. It's in our name. It's what we do. Find us at theideabrand.com.
Sorry, I didn't count down. Not good at that.
What if you counted down with vegetables? What if you were like,
Tomato,
Okay.
cucumber, jalapeno.
Carrot, celery, onion.
Thanks for joining us on the Voice of San Diego podcast in partnership with News Radio 600 Kogo. I am Scott Lewis, the editor-in-chief at Voice, joined as always by our assistant editor, Andrew Keats.
What's up, bud?
And Sarah Libby's our peerless managing editor.
Hello.
Peerless without peer.
Yeah, I have none.
Literally none around here, at least. So I used to be bizarrely proud of how ignorant I was about Sacramento. Like I was all like fiercely local. Voice of San Diego is fiercely local.
Agree that that's bizarre.
And
Yeah.
It just but over time started to get to know it. You, Sarah, took a particular interest in Sacramento. And this year, I don't know if it's because we went or we went because of the fact that we are entangled and interested in Sacramento issues as much as we have ever been. Not only is San Diego's delegation involved in some of the most controversial and interesting stuff as any legislature is doing this year, but also there's stuff that literally affects us and stuff built off of what we've reported on.
Yes.
You take AB 1184, not even the top 5 of the most interesting bills this time.
Very under the radar.
Probably 12th, maybe, something
If
like
even.
that. So, but that one's sponsored by Todd Gloria. So this is the one that would require government agencies to keep their email records for 2 years at least. Remember, we sued the school district, San Diego Unified, because they were going to get rid of all of theirs up to beyond just a year.
Mm-hmm.
And they agreed to keep them for 2 years, but only for the next, 5, was it? 6 years?
Yeah, 5 years.
And so then at that point, they could have got rid of them, earlier. And then there's a bunch of government agencies, cities, Encinitas, Poway, these other places that get rid of their emails within like 30 days, 90 days.
Yeah.
And so this would require that they keep them, and that was based on our reporting. So again, fascinating thing. There's AB 5. This would codify the court ruling that did impose a new test on whether somebody was legitimately an independent contractor or not for a company, as opposed to being an actual employee. So in short, as it stands now, freelance journalists, among others, would have to be either cut off from newsrooms they serve or become part-timers. A lot of us broke into the industry with that kind of experience. Again, something we're watching deeply. AB 5 passed the Assembly. We'll go on to the Senate now. It's got a long road to get to be law. It might change a lot. But we're all watching that. It would change our industry a lot. And then coming up on the show today, a bit of history is in the making. Police groups dropped their opposition to Assemblywoman Shirley Weber's bill, and that would change standards guiding police use of deadly force. The sudden compromise led the state assembly to approve the bill with a nearly unanimous vote. Now, did it become unanimous?
It was a unanimous vote.
So the 2 no votes were changed later. Is that how that works?
Yeah, that happens a lot, actually.
Okay. So that guy that voted against it, he was really critical of it though, but so he just wants to not be the only guy against it or something?
Yeah, there were 2 Republican assemblymen who voted against the bill, one of whom was Devin Mathis, who gave this bizarre, impassioned speech about being proud of being a white guy and therefore he has to back police and we should teach our children to respect police in all instances. Although, remember, law enforcement groups dropped their opposition to the bill. So saying you oppose it on behalf of police is a little strange.
Yeah, so we'll be talking a lot about that. We have an update on vacation rentals. And then a bizarre story we followed up this week. A Chula Vista city councilwoman made an odd choice to try to get the city to hire more police officers and firefighters by firing one of her own people. but it didn't really work out that way. But that sent my producer, Megan Wood, and I on an odd budget quest. We tried to figure something out. I think we figured it out. We owe you a post, Sarah.
Looking forward to it.
All right, that's all coming up. But first, this is the last podcast of the fundraising campaign for the spring this year. We have $5,000 more. We need you to help us get there. If you like the show, if you appreciate Andy or Sarah, probably more Sarah, if you like what we're doing here at Voice of San Diego, please make a donation. It takes just a few minutes on our site, voiceofsandiego.org. When you donate, you can leave a note. We've been reading these. We enjoy reading them in the office. Here are some that we got recently. Barry Jagoda. Hey, Barry. Writers and editors at Voice of San Diego are a treasure for San Diego. Editor Scott Lewis is a particularly fine journalist. Love that.
That's not real.
Bad take.
Barry's not real.
John Dutch. I like the nerdy podcast. Great take. Great take, right?
Yes.
Paul Rushidi, who he says, I support local journalism, particularly appreciate Voice of San Diego's coverage of local government, planning, education. And then Coyote Moon. You're the only thing I read in my email. And I use you more than my Hulu subscription. That's an endorsement.
Ringing.
I can't tell, though. It's like she didn't mention, I'm assuming Coyote's a woman. She didn't mention
Obviously.
Netflix or Amazon Prime. So it might be like, I use you more than Hulu, but not the good streaming services.
We can't complain about that, though.
I'll take it.
We can't. The third.
We're better than the fourth best streaming service. Voice of San Diego.
We just watched Shrill on Hulu. That was good.
Oh, I want to watch it.
Although the journalism depiction, have you ever noticed that no TV show has ever got journalism right?
Yes.
No TV show?
No TV show or movie. Well, I don't know. A couple movies came
Movies
close.
do okay. Yeah.
But this,
All the President's Men?
All women journalists sleep with their sources universally in every movie.
Not in Spotlight.
that's
Yeah.
okay.
I mean,
Spotlight.
the rumpled khakis in Spotlight were very accurate.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
The pleats.
that is not.
Well, in the
It's
Shrill,
Spotlight.
just quickly, the editor of this alt weekly is like
Lindy West.
Well, no,
IRL.
the Lindy West is the writer. The
Oh, okay.
actual editor that she has to serve is a total jerk, which I guess is fine. But the reasons why he's a jerk, it just doesn't make sense. Plus, their office is nice.
Yeah. That's a giveaway that it's wrong.
Nothing fits. Alt Weekly, I don't know if you've ever worked there. Alt Weekly's office don't generally look that nice. All right, news of the week. Officials from the San Diego Unified School District are pushing principals to move students out of their language support program. That's for students who are not native language or English speakers. Will Huntsberry this week had a story at Voice of San Diego. He obtained a memo that said it called on principals in the district to change the status of 75% of students currently listed as English language learners. District officials said that the 75% figure is a target, not a quota. We had an interesting internal discussion about what to call it. But the state, remember last week we talked about the state blasted San Diego Unified election or English language learning program after it did an audit of some of the schools that performed that. So another development there, fascinating issue. But basically, if it was a quota and they're pushing people to just change people without them actually being qualified, that would be bad.
Yeah, so this is a program that they have taken great pride in. They send out a lot of splashy press releases inviting people like the media to come to these ceremonies where they're celebrating, reclassifying students from English learners into just, regular students. And so it's really interesting to kind of pull back the curtain and see that principals were being aggressively pushed to reclassify students as fluent in English, and that obviously presents some concerns.
Even if it isn't a strict quota, it still strikes me as bad in general because there's no evidence that the 75% target was arrived at because of some sort of literature review that suggested that should be the amount of people who are reaching this level, which means it's not based on how many people are accomplishing the things that you need them to accomplish and therefore deserve to be put into this other area. It seems like an arbitrary metric for their own purposes. So
Yeah,
even if it's not like there aren't punishments associated with it. Even if it's just a guideline, it still seems like a guideline that is not arrived at for the right reasons.
Well, and this comes up a lot in education, right? Where there's like these artificial metrics and constructs that you're going for as opposed to like mastery of the situation. And that's just the problem with accountability issues everywhere, I guess. All right. In the other area of education.
Today we're announcing criminal charges in a wide-ranging public corruption scheme that was built around the backs of our kids, their parents.
The district attorney is prosecuting Sean McManus and Jason Schrock as the alleged leaders of a scam involving a network of charter schools where they allegedly stole more than $50 million from the state. So this is involving schools across Southern California. They allegedly created fake institutions, enrolled thousands of students without their knowledge. The students received nothing, no education or anything. The schools include 3 operating out of Dehesa Elementary School District. That's in San Diego. Dehesa's superintendent is also facing charges and has pleaded not guilty. I think the moral is every time you see online charter schools in a headline or news, it hasn't been good lately.
Never seems to be.
Never come across that online charter schools prove to be really great places to educate your children.
I mean, look, I'm not going to demean somebody for being online. We've built an entire information system online. So, but yes, it hasn't been a good run. We did a whole series 2 years ago about the school district pushing kids out of normal traditional schools into these online programs, and that didn't work out as well either. Okay. Sarah, help us lead this one. Last week, police groups dropped their opposition to Assemblywoman Shirley Weber's bill on these use of deadly force issues that we've been wrestling with across the country. Why do we think this is historic?
Yeah, so there are a few reasons. First of all, the standards guiding California's use of deadly force haven't been updated since 1872. So that makes it the oldest untouched use of force laws in the country. And it's hard to, as Councilwoman Monica Montgomery pointed out, it's hard to imagine, rules guiding any other industry that have been untouched since another century.
Right, like doctors used to just stick cigarettes in the wound or something.
So there's been a lot of talk about how this is historic, and it does kind of put California out in front in a few ways. So the standards go farther than a Supreme Court case that kind of guides a lot of states' use of force policies. There are a few states that go farther than this bill does in certain ways. Like, I think there are a few states that require officers to exhaust every possible option before they shoot somebody, and this bill doesn't do that. The state of Washington requires police to use de-escalation tactics, and this bill doesn't do that. A companion bill might.
All right, so in the past then, or currently, the reasonable threshold meant that basically all an officer had to do was justify what they did and say, I had a reason to do this.
Yeah, and that's looser than the Supreme Court standards.
Uh-huh.
So a lot of, the ACLU types have argued that, like, we're not even following current law as set by the Supreme Court, which said that deadly force, the use of it has to be objectively reasonable, which means any other officer would have done the same thing. So we don't even have that high of a standard currently.
All right. And so when you and I went to Sacramento, we talked to Shirley Weber and her team about this, and we discussed that the new law that were coming, and you and I made the point, like, it looked really bad for this bill that they were proposing. It did not. It looked like it had a really rough run ahead. And when we asked them, so they came up with a bill that, among other things, basically said officers had the right to defend themselves, like any citizen to self-defense. But beyond that, they didn't have much more latitude to use deadly force. And this week, that all changed with some kind of compromise. What did they land on, and how big of a deal was this compromise?
So each side sort of got a few of the things they want, and of course not everything. The new standard that they settled on is about, using deadly force only when it's necessary in defense of human life. So somebody has to be like in immediate danger in order to justify deadly force. And police unions successfully kind of struck out a piece of the bill that spelled out what that means, and they didn't really like the definition, which would have said that it sort of meant there was no reasonable alternative to the use of deadly force, so it no longer says that. So it's kind of up in the air as to what constitutes necessary.
Yeah, and I think, Andy, you were talking about yesterday how this really changes some of the dynamics of like these encounters we've been watching, where we've always been a little bit unsatisfied because the evaluation comes after a deadly encounter, and they're like, well, it was justified that he shot the person, and that's it. And never goes beyond like, well, maybe that wasn't the ideal outcome of this encounter. And this takes that a little farther and sort of vets that.
Yeah, and it certainly applies a new standard going forward, but it also seems to retroactively acknowledge that perhaps there was a better way to evaluate these things than we had been doing, and concedes that some of these situations were bad. Whereas there didn't seem to be room in the conversation previous to this to even acknowledge that even if something didn't rise to a prosecutable crime to the letter of California law, we could at least acknowledge that it was a scenario that maybe had been avoidable.
Yeah, and so one other big thing that advocates successfully got to keep in the bill is that kind of when you're evaluating these situations, you can take into account the actions leading up to a shooting or a use of deadly force, which could also be like a taser or something. So, if like a police officer rolls up on a situation, he doesn't use his lights, he doesn't use his sirens, he doesn't identify himself as a police officer, and he just immediately shoots someone, you can kind of take all those actions into account, whereas you couldn't really before.
And that's specifically the case with one high-profile instance here in San Diego, the Ferdun Nahad shooting in Midway. I think there's something that we wrote about quite a bit at the time, which was that all of the actions that Ferdun Nahad, the man who was shot that night, took up until the moment he was shot mattered. All of those things were allowed to be weighed in the determination of whether there was a crime that night. The fact that there was a call to 911 that said he was bothering people in a bookstore with a knife, the fact that he didn't stop when the officer first made contact with him, all of those things were allowed to be put on the ledger of whether or not this was a justified shooting. But nothing that the cop did until the moment he pulled the trigger was likewise allowed to be put on the other side of the scale. And we've learned over the course of time that he had pulled into the alley without putting his sirens or lights on, that his headlights were pointed directly at Ferdun, and it was reasonable to wonder whether he even knew that that was a police officer who was confronting him. He had moved himself out from beyond the car door, which is not as you're trained to do in a situation like this, because the car door could give you another layer of protection. And so there were all these things that said, well, had these all been handled differently, there would have been a way to avoid a shooting. But when it came time for the district attorney to determine whether or not to charge the police officer, we weren't allowed to discuss any of that.
Yeah. Also worth pointing out that the actions of Ferdun that weren't even real actions of his were taken into account, such as that he had a knife, which he did not. Yeah. He did not have a knife.
Yeah, so I think one of the fascinating things about this is just how this came to be last week, that the police union leaders came to an agreement with State Senator Tony Atkins, president, and Shirley Weber, and the leader of the Assembly, Anthony Rendon. And that change really moved Shirley Weber, and she gave what is a characteristic now spectacular speech on the Assembly floor, and we pulled a little bit of that.
Because when the tides turned last Wednesday, and someone said they were looking at television and they saw this, they said, "Look at God." And that was profound for them, that this was a force that somehow or another, this one little woman out of 80 could carry this bill with her colleagues and that a force has always been behind us to move us forward, the force of justice, the force of right, the force of making this nation a better nation every step of the way. And so I'm thankful to them. But I'm also mostly thankful to two little kids who inspire me every day, and their name is Kadir and Jaleel, my grandsons who are 7 and 5, because I've made a commitment that I never want to have that conversation with them. Their life is idyllic. They have great friends of all colors. They enjoy life, and they believe at this point that they have just as much right and respect as any other child in this nation, and that should never change. And for them, for Jaleel and Kadir, I respectfully ask for your aye vote for AB 392.
And she got it.
She did. Yeah. So even though the deal was kind of already set, this was the first chance that most people in the assembly had gotten to kind of publicly weigh in. And so it went on for hours. And, you know, obviously I don't think anyone matches Shirley Weber when she's talking about issues like this, but there were a lot of really impassioned speeches. There were tears. Reggie Jones Sawyer, who's an assemblyman from Los Angeles, said, you know, he still grips 10 and 2 when he's pulled over and isn't sure whether he's going to make it home and you know, after he's pulled over. And he said he doesn't want to have to teach his young grandchildren black drivers training, and that, you know, maybe bills like this could prevent that.
So we were talking about, is there any better speaker in San Diego's politician class than Shirley Weber? Every time she gives up to do something like that, it is profoundly moving. And she doesn't do it notes or script or anything. It's crazy. So if you have a nomination for any potential better orator than her, send it to us. All right, coming up on the other side of the break, vacation rentals, regulations, and lack thereof, or big regulations, draconian regulations even. A strange situation at Chula Vista City Council, and that sent us on a budget quest, and more.
Hey, Nate John here, Digital Manager at Voice of San Diego. While we're on a quick break, I just wanted to reiterate what Scott said at the top of the show. At the time that I'm kind of wrapping up this episode, getting the final edits in, just about to publish, we have $5,000 left to raise in our spring fundraising campaign. That's to help make the podcast, to try new projects at Voice of San Diego. That goes to the newsletters you get every week, as well as our live events. So everything we do here at Voice is impacted by this campaign, and by staying on track with that last $5,000 we're trying to raise right now. So if you can help us get there, we'd really, really appreciate it. There is a link in the show notes that you can use to give, or you can just head to voiceofsandiego.org/donate. And thanks.
We are back. We lost one. He jumped off the ship. He's down with the sharks. Andrew Keats has taken off. He's got a big breaking news item, some interviews to do. We'll see. Maybe it's not that big. He probably won't do it. I don't know.
I'll miss him now that he's been eaten by sharks.
Yeah, I mean, right? He was funny.
He was fine.
So last week, the state assembly passed a bill that would drastically curtail vacation rentals just in San Diego County. The state Senate and the governor will still have to sign off if it is to become law, but the bill would limit vacation rentals in the coastal zone and in residential zones within the coastal zone in San Diego County to just 30 days. So you could, if you had a house in one of these areas and say PB, OB, and it's in the coastal zone, most of OB is actually in the coastal zone. You have to look at the map, though. It's not a very clear line.
Yeah, I don't know what the line is.
It's look up coastal zone California, and there's a map. And in that zone, you could only have, you had a house that it was like your second home or something. You could only rent it out for up to 30 days if this legislation passes, right?
Yes.
So this is legislation from Tasha Berner Horvath from the Encinitas area, right?
Yes.
So it's her first year. She's doing a splash.
It's a big one. It's like covers the communities that happen to be most vocally opposed to vacation rentals. So
yeah,
shout out to them.
Well, that's what that gets. it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, you can see it defanging the entire discussion in San Diego, right? Because this is the most vocal group. Now, there are people in University Heights, downtown, other places upset about vacation rentals, but by far the most concern about them is on the coast, right?
The most concern from residents who don't want them.
Right,
yes.
right. And so it gets to the question like, why just the coast? And you can, on the one hand, you get it because politically, well, that's who's upset about it. But on the other hand, it's like, wait, so just because they're nice or they have nice things?
I mean, especially because I watched her argue for the bill in the committee hearing, and she, predicated the entire need for the bill on the housing crisis.
Right.
And so if that's your argument, I mean, like, that's where the least affordable housing is anyway. And so, I don't know how she reconciles that.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. There's a lot of people looking for homes and running into vacation rentals in downtown or in Bankers Hill and these kind of places. So it's kind of a fascinating why that's happening. So I have a theory that it really would defang the debate. It would remove it as a mayoral issue, in my opinion. But it could also, maybe it just kicks it up as like, well, what about the rest of the city? I don't know. What do you think?
I think they would still probably try to do something, but like the passions would be so neutralized after this that maybe they could actually get something done when it matters the least.
So the city passed that bill or that law I guess it was a year ago, that would have sharply regulated vacation rentals within the city.
Not this sharply, though.
Right. But it would have gotten rid of Mission Beach vacation rentals. And we were all kind of shocked about what that would be like. Well, this would do that.
Yeah.
And it's happening. It's gotten through the assembly. So, I mean, maybe it could get changed. So it's considered like a pilot thing?
Yeah, it's a pilot program that, theoretically could be replicated across the state. But I think that, I'm not sure what her reasoning is, but, you would think that there would be not as much objection from other lawmakers if it didn't impact their districts at all. They're just like, sure, fine, do whatever.
Whatever you want to try out in that little place of yours. Final issue we wanted to tackle, we were all kind of stunned last week when we got the news that in the middle of a Chula Vista City Council meeting, Councilwoman Jill Galvez announced that she was firing her aide. And this is somebody we all knew, a guy named Robert Moreno, who was a former journalist, and that's why we knew him. I got accused, somebody said, like, you wouldn't have cared about this if it wasn't a former journalist. And I responded, like, I think I would have cared about it, but I might not have heard about it.
Sure.
I think that's fair. So it wasn't because she didn't fire him because she didn't like him, or supposedly says she didn't.
At least not publicly, yeah.
She later clarified she wanted to free up money to hire firefighters and police officers. And so she's basically like, I'll cut this. What can you guys all do, right?
Yes. I think she was trying to convince her, colleagues to do the same. And they're like, nah.
Yeah. Like, I watched the hearing and they were all like, well, no. The mayor, Mary Salas, said, look, even if I did want to do that, the future city council members might be mad at me for having cut that out of the budget. And so they didn't do that. So the guy is out of the job, but there's no money freed up in the budget for this purpose. And even if it had been, his job would have barely funded not even one police officer.
It wouldn't have funded a police officer, and also it didn't do anything.
Right.
The most compelling part of the story to me was when the police chief was like, please don't fire people to pay for police. We don't want that on our conscience. And that's not a good strategy for solving this problem. So the police chief doesn't want this.
Well, they're really insistent. They're like, we can't even hire people fast enough. So it's not like there's a budget crisis and they need to free up money wherever they can. Now, she got herself in trouble because she also mentioned another person, the director of cultural arts, the program at the city of Chula Vista. She's like, we can fire that person too, and that'll free up a little bit more money. Well, the union that represents that person has now launched a recall campaign against her. They supported her for the city council, and now they're like, why did you do that? So it's a whole mess. But underneath all of this is Galvez's point that the city is not making good on promises that it made to voters last year in the campaign to increase the city's sales tax. The campaign was heavily centered around the city's need for police officers and firefighters. Galvez said the budget does not include what was promised, and she challenged me on the phone to look at that and find out. So challenge accepted. Okay, so to figure this out, I had to bring in a ringer. I asked Megan Wood to help me do this. Megan Wood's on staff. Megan Wood has other responsibilities, but she is also competent and resourceful. And so I asked her to help me do this and figure out this. Hello, Megan.
Hello.
So I asked you to go figure out how many people worked for the police department in Chula Vista and how many people used to work there. And that wasn't as easy as we might have suspected it to be.
No, it took a couple days.
Okay, so Megan, tell me, after the tax increase, which went into effect when?
October 2018.
October 2018, they've started collecting more money because of it for government services. Have they added police officers?
They've added 3 police officers.
Have they added firefighters?
Compared to last year, they've added 1.
Have they added as many as they could in their budget?
No. So there's a few vacancies still that they're trying to fill. Firefighters, they're trying to fill 11 positions. And for the police department, they're trying to fill 8.
Okay, so the money is there.
Right.
But they can't or won't hire them.
Yeah, they say that, they can't find the talent.
So it's not. So do we think, now that we look back at what Galvez said, that she wanted to cut this position in her budget so that she could, free up money that they could add more people? It doesn't seem right now as though it's a money problem, unless they're hiding something and pretending that those open positions could be filled when there's like, oh, we can't actually fill them because that would ruin things.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it was necessary.
All right. Megan Wood with the truth. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks for listening to the Voice of San Diego podcast. Again, if you like listening to the show each week and if you value what we're doing here at Voice, please consider making a donation. You see the link in our show notes for that, or just go to the website, voiceofsandiego.org. I'm Scott Lewis, CEO and Editor-in-Chief. Andrew Keats is Assistant Editor. Do you want to say anything about him while he's gone?
No.
He's fine.
He's all right.
He's fine. Sarah Libby's Managing Editor. The show is produced by Nate John, who's really good, Adriana Heldes, who's also really good, and Megan Wood, who's great. So we'll talk to you next week.